I thought I'd finally found peace in the woods until I realized I wasn't alone. The cabin looked innocent enough, rustic, tucked away between towering pines, the kind of place you see in postcards and dream about when the city feels too loud. I'd been craving solitude, a break from the endless hum of notifications and obligations. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, the way it always does just after a rain. Birds called softly in the distance, and the creek nearby hummed a gentle lullaby. Everything felt perfectly, almost unnervingly serene. I unpacked slowly, deliberately. My bag thudded onto the creaking wooden floor, the sound too loud in the quiet cabin. I laughed to myself, thinking how ridiculous it was to feel jittery in a place so isolated. But even as I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I blamed it on nerves, the imagination running wild. That's what I told myself as I lit a fire in the fireplace and sank into the worn armchair, trying to let the warmth ease the tension in my shoulders. Then, just as I began to feel genuinely relaxed, I heard it. A subtle sound at first, so faint I thought it might be the wind. But it grew sharper, deliberate. Footsteps, slow, measured, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, my heartbeat pounding louder than the noise, certain I was imagining it. And yet each step confirmed the impossible truth. I was not alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows seemed loaded with intent. And that's when I remembered something I'd read online. Abandoned cabins often hold stories, terrifying, hidden truths most people never uncover. 10 stories to be exact. I hadn't known all of them yet, but I knew I wanted to. And if I thought my little weekend escape was unsettling, that was just the beginning. Let me take you deeper into these tales, the ones that start in seemingly ordinary places and end somewhere far darker than you ever imagined. Each story reveals a truth so chilling, you'll question whether you'd ever want to spend a night alone in the woods again. I arrived at the cabin just as a thick gray fog rolled in, swallowing the path behind me. The air was damp, clinging to my skin, carrying the sharp tang of decaying leaves. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and the familiar trees seemed distorted, their trunks twisting like shadows in a dream. Even in the haze, the cabin looked wrong. Not in decay, exactly, but as if it had been waiting, patient, for someone or something to arrive. Pushing open the heavy door, a low creak echoed inside, swallowed almost immediately by the fog outside. The interior smelled faintly of smoke and earth, but there was an underlying sharpness, metallic and bitter. I set down my pack and ran my fingers along the walls, immediately catching on something odd. Strange symbols etched deeply into the wood. They weren't crude. Someone had taken care to carve them precisely, deliberately. Circles overlapping with lines that resembled letters I didn't recognize. patterns that hummed in my mind like a soundless chant. I shivered and stepped back, trying to rationalize it. Old logging marks, perhaps, or some long-forgotten folk ritual. Then came the noises. At first, just small things. A soft thud behind me, a whisper of movement near the fireplace. Objects seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. A chair slightly askew, a kettle not where I'd left it. I told myself it was the wind, the fog pressing through gaps in the walls, playing tricks on my senses. But there was an insistence to it, a rhythm that felt intentional, like a pulse beneath the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, exploring further, but each room held more signs of someone or something being there before me. On the table, a small pile of twigs arranged in a pattern mirroring the symbols on the wall. A set of footprints in the dust, too large for me, led toward the back of the cabin and stopped abruptly. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold weight settle into my chest. The fog pressed against the windows now, thick and suffocating, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within it. As evening fell, the cabin seemed to exhale, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I was about to retreat to the bedroom when a loud final slam made my blood run cold. The back door had closed on its own. Heart hammering, I rushed to the window, only to freeze in place. A dark silhouette pressed against the glass, unmoving, watching. It wasn't human, or at least, not like any human I knew. I stumbled back, fumbling for my flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the fog outside. Every instinct screamed to leave, but something compelled me to stay. Rooted by fear and fascination, I barely slept that night, but the worst was yet to come. Story 2. The Hitchhiker Who Never Left. I was driving along a deserted stretch of road late at night, the headlights cutting through the darkness like knives, when I saw him. A lone figure standing by the shoulder, thumb extended, rain dripping from his jacket. The kind of cliché hitchhiker you tell yourself never exists. But there he was, drenched and shivering, looking like he'd been waiting for hours. I hesitated, then slowed, rationalizing that it was the right thing to do. "Thanks," he muttered, sliding into the passenger seat without a word of protest. He smelled faintly of smoke and something earthy, like damp soil. We drove in silence for a few miles, the only sounds my tires on the wet asphalt and his quiet breathing. Then he spoke, casually, almost too casually. "You know," he said, "some roads aren't really roads at all. They lead to places people aren't meant to find." I laughed nervously. "You mean like shortcuts?" He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Or maybe something beyond it." "No, I mean places that remember you, even after you leave, that watch, that wait." A chill ran down my spine. His words were oddly specific, like he knew more than he should. I tried to change the subject, asking where he was headed. He only smiled faintly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. I've been traveling this road for a long time. Sometimes I never leave. Sometimes people think I do. I frowned. There was something wrong with him. An intangibility, a weightlessness that made the seat feel colder beside me. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. No door opened, no door closed. I jerked the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror. Empty. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, searching the road behind me. Nothing. Shaking, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd imagined him, maybe the fog, maybe exhaustion. But then I noticed subtle signs that made my blood run cold. The seatbelt that had been fastened now hung loose. My jacket, which I'd left on the passenger seat, was slightly crumpled, as if someone had just been sitting there. And faint scratches along the door frame, shallow but deliberate, as though fingernails had dragged across the paint. I parked, staring at the empty road, questioning my own mind. The night was silent again, too silent, and the feeling of being watched returned. Closer this time. Every instinct screamed that he hadn't really left, that some part of him lingered, waiting, tethered to me in ways I couldn't understand. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion. But exhaustion doesn't leave scratches on your car. Story 3. The cabin with no map. We were just a group of friends, eager for a weekend hike, when we stumbled across it. A cabin that didn't exist on any map. We had been following the trail, joking and laughing, when the trees thickened and the path seemed to vanish. And then, almost like it had appeared out of nowhere, it was there, weathered and grey, surrounded by undergrowth so dense it seemed unnatural. The cabin exuded an unspoken warning we chose to ignore. The air around it was heavy, saturated with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something metallic, tangy, and faintly rotten. A crow cawed from the canopy above, and the sound echoed oddly, as if the forest itself was amplifying it. Hesitation flickered in our minds, but curiosity carried us forward. The door creaked when we pushed it open, revealing a small interior lit only by the muted daylight slipping through grime-covered windows. Inside, we found letters, piled neatly on a splintered table, some yellowed with age, others fresher, almost recent. Each letter was addressed to no one in particular, written in scrawled, uneven handwriting. They described events that made our skin crawl. Objects moving of their own accord, whispers behind closed doors, glimpses of figures that vanished when confronted. The tone of desperation grew with each note, and a pattern emerged. No one had ever left this place unchanged. We laughed nervously, blaming our imaginations. But the unease persisted. The cabin seemed to breathe around us, the silence thick enough to drown out our own voices. Shadows pooled in corners, and every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than it should. When we stepped outside to retrace our steps, we discovered something terrifying. The trail had disappeared. The trees had shifted, or maybe we had, and the path we had been following was gone. Every direction looked identical: twisting trunks, dense underbrush, and that same oppressive, unnatural quiet. We tried to navigate, marking trees with scratches, snapping twigs, anything to orient ourselves, but it was as if the forest itself rejected our presence. Hours passed, the sun lowering into the horizon, and we realized we weren't just lost, we were being watched. Glimpses of movement caught our eyes, shapes darting between trees, always just at the edge of vision. Each sound, crunching leaves, snapping branches, made us jump, hearts pounding. Certain someone or something was tracking our every step. The cabin lingered in our minds, a constant reference point that didn't help. It was impossible to know if returning meant safety or a deeper descent into whatever force controlled this place. Fear grew into a tangible weight pressing on our chests, and the letters' warnings rang louder than any rational thought. By nightfall, we weren't just lost, we were being watched. Story 4. The whispers in the trees. I can still hear it, even now, years later. The whispers. I was alone that weekend, camping in a section of forest I'd been told was untouched, pristine, the kind of place where you could finally escape the noise of the world. During the day, it lived up to its promise: sunlight spilling through the leaves, birds calling overhead, the soft rustle of the wind. Peaceful, almost sacred. But night has a way of revealing truths the day hides. The first whisper came just as the fire had burned low, the flames casting long, trembling shadows. It was so faint, I thought it was the wind, teasing the leaves. I strained to listen, and there it was again. A syllable, barely a word, curling through the trees like smoke. I called out, thinking a hiker had wandered close, but the silence that answered me was unnerving. Too complete, too deliberate. I tried to laugh it off, shaking my head as I poked at the fire. But then the shadows began to move differently, not with the flicker of flames, not with the sway of branches, but with intention. Shapes stretched and twisted among the trunks, always at the edge of my vision, retreating whenever I looked directly. Fear prickled at my skin, but a part of me couldn't look away. It felt alive, as if the forest itself was breathing, watching, learning. I kept hearing the whispers throughout the night, growing bolder, threading through the rustling leaves, circling me. I thought about my friend who had insisted on joining me, but had turned back earlier in the day. My mind kept imagining him out there, waiting, or worse, listening. I called for him, my voice cracking, but no answer came. Only the whispers, always just out of reach, teasing, beckoning. Hours blurred. Every snap of a twig, every crack of a branch became a question. I couldn't answer. My fire dwindled, and with it, my sense of safety. The forest seemed to respond to my fear, shaping itself around it. Every shadow exaggerated, every sound amplified. I stumbled through the undergrowth, trying to convince myself I would find a path out. But the terrain had shifted. The trees seemed taller, closer, almost protective or possessive. When dawn finally broke, I found myself back at the edge of the clearing where I'd set up camp. Alone, no sign of my friend, no indication the night's horrors had been anything but real. But the whispers never entirely faded. Even as I packed up and left, they lingered in my mind, threading through every quiet moment. I never returned to that forest, and I never saw him again. I thought it was over, but the forest had other plans. Story 5. The room that wasn't there. I knew what I saw, but it shouldn't have been possible. The cabin was old, wooden beams warped by decades of rain, floorboards groaning underfoot. I'd stayed there during a solo trip, thinking it would be like all the other cabins I'd visited, quiet, isolated, ordinary. Yet, on my second night, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was small, unassuming, tucked into a corner where no architectural logic should have allowed it. My first thought was that I'd overlooked it, or maybe it had been concealed behind an old tapestry. But something about it didn't sit right. I tried the handle. It was locked, stubborn. I jiggled it, pushed harder, and finally, with a sound that made my stomach lurch, it gave way. The hinges groaned, but the door opened into nothing I recognized. The room stretched wider than the cabin could possibly contain. The ceiling dipped and warped, shadows twisting along the walls, defying every sense of proportion I had. It smelled of old paper, wet earth, and something acrid, almost chemical. Inside, objects were arranged with a careless, deliberate chaos. A pair of worn boots sat next to a broken lantern. On the table were letters, scrawled notes from previous visitors, some dating back decades. Each contained the same frantic theme: sightings of impossible spaces, of rooms that should not exist, objects that shifted or multiplied, shadows that moved against logic itself. I flipped one over and nearly dropped it. Inside was a map of the very cabin I'd been staying in, but with additional rooms, corridors, and hidden spaces marked, none of which had ever existed on any real blueprint. As I explored further, my heart pounding, I noticed the condensation on a small, grimy window. A single message had been written there, as though someone or something had pressed their fingers against the glass. "You don't belong here." I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the message remained, smudged but unmistakable. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift when I moved, stretching impossibly, yet always staying just out of reach. It was as if the room itself were aware of me, conscious, predatory even. I remember clutching a chair, trying to convince myself that exhaustion or the fog outside had distorted my perception. But I wasn't alone in noticing these anomalies. Online forums, community reports from hikers, campers, and cabin visitors. All described similar impossible rooms, hidden spaces, and shifting walls. The overlap was uncanny, terrifying. Proof, perhaps, that these cabins shared some unexplainable connection, some rule I couldn't comprehend. I finally stepped back to leave, the door shrinking back to normal dimensions as if the room were retracting itself, and the message on the glass fading like smoke. My chest ached, sweat prickling my skin, but a deeper, more unsettling chill settled in my bones. The experience didn't end with that night. Even in the cabin's ordinary rooms, I could feel the presence of that impossible space, waiting, patient. I wish I could forget what I found inside. Story 6. The Snowbound Stranger. The snow fell silently that night, blanketing the wilderness in a pristine, almost holy quiet. I had arrived at the cabin hours earlier, alone, hoping for solitude, the crunch of snow under my boots, the only sound breaking the stillness. The warmth from the fireplace made the world outside feel distant, safe. That illusion shattered when a knock echoed through the wooden walls. Sharp, deliberate. I hesitated, thinking perhaps a lost traveler, but the road was miles away, the snow treacherous and deep. Cautiously, I opened the door to reveal a man, soaked and shivering, his eyes unnervingly calm. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice soft but unnerving, as if he already knew the answer. I nodded, stepping aside, heart hammering. Once inside, he shook snow from his coat and stared at me in a way that made my skin crawl. "You've been avoiding it," he said matter-of-factly, "but it won't stay buried forever." I froze. I I don't know what you mean," I stammered, trying to mask my rising panic. He smiled faintly. "Oh, you do. The choices, the regrets, even the little lies you tell yourself at night." He named things, events, people, details only I could know, some I hadn't even shared aloud. The warmth of the cabin became irrelevant. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer, eager to hear more. I told him he had to leave, but he simply walked closer, calm and deliberate, as if the storm outside didn't matter. "I've been waiting," he said, "and I've seen what comes next. You can't run from it. Not here. Not ever." Every instinct screamed to push him out, but part of me was frozen, trapped by disbelief and dread. The snow outside glimmered under the moonlight, serene and peaceful, a sharp contrast to the terror in the cabin. His knowledge, his calm certainty, made the air thick and suffocating. I could feel the walls of my mind pressing inward, my own memories twisting under his gaze. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt meaningless. When he finally stepped back toward the door, I found my voice. "Why me? Why here?" He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Because this place remembers. And I remember too. The choices you think are yours. Sometimes they're just the echoes of what's already been written." Then he was gone, swallowed by the night and snow, as if he'd never existed. I locked every door, bolted every window, trying to convince myself that safety was possible. But the words, the precise knowledge of my life, lingered in my mind, gnawing at my certainty, making me question what was real. The stranger's words still echo in my mind, chilling me even in the brightest day. I locked all the doors, but locking the past is impossible. Story 7. The Midnight Knock. Every night at exactly midnight, the knock came. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, echoing through the cabin like a metronome set to measure my fear. The first night, I told myself it was the wind or a branch brushing against the siding. At least it was punctual, I thought with a bitter laugh. Predictable, almost comforting. But the second night, I couldn't ignore it. I got out of bed, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, and opened the door. Nothing. Just the quiet, the snow-slicked path beyond, and my own rapid breathing. I stepped back inside, but something was off. A chair I'd left neatly against the wall was now overturned. My backpack, zipped shut the night before, was open, its contents scattered across the floor. I told myself it was a dream, or exhaustion, or maybe I'd been careless. The third night, the knock came again. 3 sharp raps, exactly at midnight, piercing the quiet like a warning. This time, I stayed in the doorway longer, flashlight scanning every shadow. Nothing appeared, yet I could feel it. Something just beyond perception, waiting, patient, watching. And then I noticed the clock. It was an hour ahead or behind. Time had shifted, subtly, unnervingly. My mind reeled, trying to rationalize it. But the cabin itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm that wasn't my own. I began noticing more anomalies. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Shadows stretched impossibly across walls, lingering even when the light source changed. Sometimes I heard whispers, but when I turned, the cabin was empty. The knocks didn't always align perfectly with the clock anymore. Sometimes a few seconds early, sometimes late. But they always came, reminding me that something was keeping time here, marking its own schedule. By the fourth night, I tried recording the sound, video, even placing cameras outside. Playback revealed nothing but silence. Yet, the knocks still came, as if mocking my attempts to document them. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every sigh of the cabin made my heart race. The familiar comfort of the place had twisted into something alien. I felt the walls pressing inward, compressing reality until I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming. By the third night, I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming. Story 8. The photograph that moved. The cabin felt warm and inviting when I arrived. A place frozen in time, filled with the faint smell of wood smoke and old paper. On the mantel, above the fireplace, sat a small collection of photographs. Yellowed edges, curled corners, a nostalgic snapshot of the cabin's past. I picked one up, smiling at the image of a family gathered around a dinner table, unaware that their lives would not remain so ordinary. The first night, I noticed something odd. One of the photos, the one of the empty cabin interior, had shifted slightly. Not enough to be immediately noticeable, just a subtle tilt, as if someone had leaned it forward while I slept. I chalked it up to an uneven shelf or my own fatigue. But by morning, small changes had appeared. A cup on the table moved, shadows in the corners longer, darker. I felt a twinge of unease, but ignored it, trying to convince myself it was coincidence. Then the photos began to show things I hadn't noticed before. Figures in windows that hadn't been there before. Shadows in doorways that matched no one I knew. One night, I saw it clearly. A figure crouched beside the fireplace, its face blurred, indistinct, but unmistakably human. I froze, my breath caught. Yet, when I blinked, the room was empty. My eyes darted back to the mantel, and there it was again. Altered, the shadow now in the photograph itself. I started documenting each photo, taking notes, comparing them daily. Each image became progressively more disturbing. A storm breaking through the windows, footprints appearing on the snow outside. A broken chair lying across the floor. The worst was the last one I found, hidden behind the others. I hesitated, knowing instinctively that I shouldn't look. But curiosity, terrifying, irresistible, won. It depicted me, standing in the doorway of the cabin, eyes wide with fear. But I hadn't taken that photo. My own expression, my own posture, perfectly captured. And the surroundings were not as they were now. The shadows stretched unnaturally, the corners dark and alive. I tried to put the photo down, but my hand shook. The image felt alive, pulsating with some unholy anticipation, as if it were waiting for the moment it would become reality. Every night afterward, I checked the photos, noticing small movements, subtle alterations such as I began to dread opening my eyes in the morning. Objects in the room seemed to mirror the images, reflecting the future the photographs promised, each one more horrifying than the last. I realized then that some knowledge is forbidden, that some curiosities are punishable simply by observation. I shouldn't have looked. Every photo I took since hasn't been quite right. Story 9. The Forgotten Neighbor. I always thought the cabin next door was uninhabited. The small structure peeked out from behind a wall of trees, crooked and weathered, almost fading into the landscape. That is until the first knock came. A man introduced himself with a smile so wide it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been expecting you," he said, as if our meeting had been arranged long before I even arrived. I laughed nervously. Obviously, this was the neighbor everyone on the internet says doesn't exist. Over the next few days, our interactions grew stranger. He asked questions that were too personal, things I hadn't told anyone, past regrets, the books I'd read, the music I loved, and yet there was no trace of him online, no property records, nothing. The postman didn't know him. No neighbors had ever seen him. I started to joke darkly that maybe I had stumbled into some kind of alternate dimension. He chuckled, as if he'd been expecting that, and said, "Dimensions are only complicated if you insist on thinking linearly." Things escalated quickly. One morning, I stepped outside to borrow sugar and found him in my own kitchen, reading a newspaper I hadn't bought. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving only a faint chill and the faint smell of smoke. My mind raced. I'd laughed at the idea of time loops before, but now every interaction seemed to repeat itself with subtle differences. A cup I'd left on the porch would reappear in the living room. Footsteps echoed down halls. I didn't remember walking. Despite the absurdity, I couldn't help observing, learning from him, trying to understand the pattern. His presence felt both comforting and oppressive, like a puzzle I couldn't solve. He claimed to have lived in the cabin for longer than anyone remembers, a phrase I initially dismissed as eccentric humor. But when I peeked at old maps and census records, the land was empty, always had been. The cabin next door simply didn't exist in any documented reality. By the third week, I noticed the subtle parallels to the other cabins I'd read about. Impossible rooms, shadows that moved independently, whispers in the wind. It was as if he were part of some larger network of hidden, inescapable patterns. Each cabin a node in a puzzle too vast for any one person to grasp. I tried to warn myself to leave, to break free of the loop, but each attempt was thwarted by coincidence or something far stranger. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late to leave. Story 10. The final warning. I thought I had seen it all. After the cabins in the fog, the hitchhiker, the rooms that shouldn't exist, I believed I could steel myself for anything. But the last cabin was different. It didn't wait for you to notice it. It called. It called. Hidden in a grove where the trees grew impossibly close, its roof sagging like a tired breath. It seemed alive. The moment I stepped onto the path, the air thickened, the silence pressing against my ears, making it hard to breathe. Inside, the smell hit first, a mixture of rotting wood, cold iron, and something acrid I couldn't place. The floorboards groaned under my weight as if the cabin were testing me, gauging whether I belonged. And then I saw it. A wall covered in photographs, letters, and scratched notes. All the cabins I had visited, all the strange encounters, everything was documented here. Names, dates, locations, symbols carved into wood, sketches of impossible rooms. It was a map of terror, proof that these events were not isolated, not random. They were connected, part of a web I had stumbled into without understanding. Shadows shifted at the edges of the room, longer and darker than any light source should allow. I realized that the cabin wasn't just haunted. It was sentient. It absorbed fear, fed on curiosity, and ensured that anyone who lingered became part of its record. Every detail I'd thought separate, the hitchhiker, the whispers, the impossible photographs, were threads leading to this final point. I felt it in my chest, a cold weight pressing downward, warning me that the culmination of all these horrors had arrived. I wanted to leave, but the door vanished, replaced by a smooth wall, unyielding. The windows offered only fog, no escape. Panic clawed at me, every instinct screaming to run. But every step seemed preordained, leading me deeper into the cabin's heart. And then I understood. The cabins themselves were a network, a series of tests, traps, or warnings. And I had ignored everyone. Now I was part of the narrative, a story in the making, recorded for whoever or whatever came next. I am telling you this because you need to hear it. If you ever find a cabin in the woods, no matter how inviting, no matter how quiet or serene, leave immediately. Do not explore. Do not linger. Do not read the letters or study the photographs. Curiosity will cost more than a sleepless night. It may cost you your mind, your memories, your very existence. The final warning is this: these places are not just relics or abandoned shelters. They are alive, aware, and patient. They watch the way you move, the way you think, and the choices you make. And if you stay too long, if you look too closely, they will find a way to make you part of their story. I escaped, or at least I think I did. But I carry the fear, the memory, and the understanding that what you ignore in the woods may be waiting for you, waiting for someone else. And perhaps, one day, you. The cabins are not over. And the worst part? The web continues, ready to ensnare the next curious soul. Looking back on all 10 cabins, the details blur in my memory. But the feeling, the cold, pressing weight of fear, remains sharp. Each story, each encounter taught me the same terrifying lesson. These places are not simply abandoned or forgotten. They are alive in ways we cannot understand, feeding on curiosity, observation, and the smallest spark of fear. The fog that hides the cabins, the whispers in the trees, the doors that shouldn't exist. They are not coincidences. They are warnings. Though whether we recognize them in time is another question entirely. Even now, Rirsa, I can feel it lingering in the corners of my thoughts. Some of the cabin's secrets may never be fully revealed. Some of the shadows may still be moving just beyond the edge of our vision. And perhaps, even as you listen or read these tales, there is a cabin somewhere, waiting, quiet, patient, watching for the next curious soul to step inside. I want to know if any of you have encountered something like this, or felt the pull of a place that shouldn't exist. Share your stories, your experiences, your own whispers from the woods. There's something almost comforting in knowing that others have glimpsed the same strange, unsettling truths. And yet, there's no denying the danger. Reading about these cabins, thinking about them, might be safe, maybe, but being drawn to one, even unknowingly, can change everything. The patterns repeat, the creaking floorboards, the shifting shadows, the fog that conceals and isolates, the letters, the photographs, the inexplicable presences that seem tied to our very thoughts. They're all threads in a larger tapestry, connecting every cabin, every story, every whisper into a network we may never fully comprehend. And sometimes, understanding comes too late. So, as you think about these tales, consider this. Curiosity is a dangerous companion. The urge to explore, to uncover, to know, it's exactly what these places feed on. And I can tell you from experience, some truths are better left untouched. Some doors are better left closed. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover. Are you sure you want to sleep tonight?